Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. Today we continue our series of lessons from the Old Testament from the book of Job. And today our lesson will be drawn from we'll cover most of the 36th chapter of Job. As our lessons so far have demonstrated, at least to me, and I hope I've conveyed that to you, the chapters are relatively easy to summarize in a very short sentence or two. Today's lesson is really not much different. But we will look at all of it, to all of the focal verses plus a few others, in order to get a real sense of it. Today we're going to be introduced to a fourth character, if you will, a fourth friend of Job's, this one named Elihu. Elihu begins a series of addresses to Job back in chapter 32. He is the son of Buz, who I read in another study is the brother of Uz, U-Z, and it is the land of Uz that Job lives in. This is probably, as we discussed in the first study, and I shouldn't spend very much time in it because we don't have enough time to cover everything that we have. It's probably southeast of Israel, sometime between Abraham and Joshua, quite probably in that time frame, is the setting for Job. Elihu is one of Job's friends. He identifies in chapter 32, where he began speaking, that he is the youngest. He is younger than Job and the other friends. But Elihu, to an extent, agrees with the other three friends of Job. That is, that Job has sinned. Now, Elihu's concept of Job's sinning really has more to do with Job's responses to God following the suffering that he has experienced. And it is tremendous, tragic. He loses 10 children. He loses all of his possessions. He becomes basically abhorrent to his wife, and even his friends somewhat turn on him. They say that he has sinned, obviously, because God rewards the righteous and punishes the sinful or the sinner. That's their main concept. And Job's response to them and then to God is to question God. Why are you doing this to me? Because I am not a sinner. And we know, even though Job's friends don't agree, God does agree with Job. He is a righteous man. God holds Job up to Satan as an example of a righteous man. But Elihu, I hesitate to say chastises Job, but to some extent he says, you are sinning. You are sinning in the way you question God. That would be in chapter 33, that comment or statement or idea. By suggesting that God is not just, Job, you're suggesting God is not just because he is punishing you. That's the general idea of really the Mosaic law as well. God is punishing you. And Job says, that's not just. I'm not being justly punished because in spite of my friend's insistence that I must have sinned, I haven't. And Job also, that's found in Elihu's addresses in chapter 34. And then there's in chapter 35, he suggests Job is sinning by expressing or feeling that there is no reward for righteousness, or at least his own righteousness. And so in his final, this is the final address, and next it goes into chapter 37, Elihu turns to focus mostly on God rather than Job, and explaining, in essence, how or why Job is wrong. And so let's look at that. I'm going to touch on a few verses. Our focal verses for today's Sunday school lesson start at verse 8 and go through verse 23. But to get a sense, let's look at verses 1 through 4. Or at least to start with, let's do 1 through 4. Elihu continued, says verse 1, "Bear with me a little longer, and I will show you that there is more to be said in God's behalf. I get my knowledge from afar. I will ascribe justice to my Maker. Be assured that my words are not false. One who has perfect knowledge is with you." Now, Elihu is going to, in essence, chastise Job for his arrogance, insisting that he is righteous. But Elihu is taking a great deal of credit here, or seemingly so. He says, I got my knowledge from afar, suggesting that he gets his words that he's saying to Job from God himself. My words are not false. One who has perfect knowledge is with you. Don't think Elihu is claiming that he has perfect knowledge. It is God who has perfect knowledge, but God has given that to Elihu to pass on to Job. He starts out by saying, bear with me just a little longer. He has been talking for four chapters. He says, bear with me just a little longer, and I'm going to speak in God's behalf, is basically what he says here. Now he's going to turn to the attributes of God. And here, Elihu does speak a lot of truth. But he, like his friends, are missing an element here. The idea is God rewards the righteous and punishes the sinner. But let's look at, if you're the one who is suffering, even though you have not sinned, and we know that suffering sometimes comes not because of your sin. Jesus himself says that. But let me get on into our passage. Verse 5, God is mighty, but despises no one. He is mighty and firm in his purpose. God is mighty, no doubt about it. Elihu might be saying here, as the second part of it, nobody doubts that God is mighty. But God, although mighty, doesn't despise or think little of anyone. It's also possible that Elihu is saying that although God is mighty, in spite of the fact that God is mighty, he doesn't think little of all the little people in the world. God is mighty, but he is without fault as he looks at people. He does not keep the wicked alive, but gives the afflicted their rights, verse 6. So God deals with the wicked and the poor in different ways, says Elihu. He doesn't despise anyone, that's verse 5, but at the same time, he's not going to give special protection to the wicked. There's a side jab to Job here. He's not going to protect you, even though it looks like he always had, if you're wicked. God also gives justice to the poor and afflicted, which is what Job has been challenging, because Job is saying, where's the justice in me being afflicted? Job's thinking that God has denied him justice. Elihu says, that's not true. Not so. And so then Elihu now focuses on God's righteousness, or he focuses on those who are righteous and how God treats those who are. Verse 7, he does not take his eyes off the righteous. God does not take his eyes off the righteous, says Elihu. He enthrones them with kings and exalts them forever. So, not only does God not despise the righteous, Job, he doesn't despise you. You're not being punished because he despises you, the righteous, even though poor and afflicted. Job has never been poor until the afflictions occurred. But not only that, he gives them justice. But Elihu says it's as if God not only doesn't despise them, he puts those who are righteous, even though poor and even though afflicted, he raises them up, even putting them on thrones alongside kings. He thinks highly of them, just like people think of kings. He exalts them. And exalts them forever. Even so, life sometimes is hard for the poor and afflicted. And Elihu begins to acknowledge that in the next few verses. Sometimes the righteous do experience affliction. And so we get to the verses, and that's where we're going to. We get to the verses for our study today, starting with verse 8. But if people are bound in chains, held fast by cords of affliction, he tells them what they have done, that they have sinned arrogantly. And speaking of arrogance, Elihu, as we said, talking about verse 1 through 4, he's the one who says he doesn't say he has perfect knowledge. He says God does, but God has given it to him, so he's almost arrogant. Elihu is saying here in these couple of verses that there are times, he's not saying to Job this is one of those times, but sometimes a righteous person whom God is concerned about, even exalting them, sometimes a person like that is afflicted. Now that is an absolute truism. Elihu is absolutely correct there. We all know of friends, maybe even families, who have suffered because of affliction or of seeming loss, a loss to someone who is seemingly without sin. I know most of you know I lost a wife to cancer, who not only she wasn't perfect, in my eyes she was, but she was not without sin, but she was not a sinner. She was one of the most righteous, God-fearing, God-loving, God-speaking people in the world. I lost her to cancer. I'm the one that was afflicted. She certainly was afflicted with the cancer and the battle against the cancer. And so Elihu says, it happens. God is often gracious to let them know, and here now he errs again, Elihu, that a sin has been committed, and the affliction is for the purpose of letting that person know that they have sinned. Elihu like his three friends, is missing the fact, making assumptions that because Job was afflicted, even though he was righteous, obviously he had sinned. That's not true. That's not correct. It's not always correct. Sometimes we do suffer as a result of our own sins. But Elihu is assuming, just like his co-friends of Job, that that's what is causing the affliction. But God is using that to bring you back to him, is Elihu's suggestion. Look at verse 10. He makes them listen to correction and commands them to repent of their evil. In other words, suffering may, in fact, be God's way of calling someone back into right relationship with him. Again, though, Elihu's assumption is that that is the only basis for the affliction of the righteous. They have sinned or gone astray, and God is bringing them back to them. So he is going to suggest that how that righteous person reacts to God's treatment of them determines how their response to God. And there's a couple of ways that a righteous person who is suffering, says Elihu. Now, once again, he has gone down a wrong trail here. Some of his truisms are true, but by assuming it applies to all, he's down the wrong trail. Verse 11, if they obey and serve him, they will spend the rest of their days in prosperity and their years in contentment. So there's one way for the righteous person to respond to God's affliction. It's to obey God and serve him. Well, Job, if he were able to speak here and get a word in edgewise with Elihu, and he ultimately will, he would say, but I am obeying him and I am serving him, so why the affliction? Elihu says, well, if you will, you'll spend your days in prosperity and contentment. Of course, we're going to see at the end of the book of Job that is true. He does obey and serve God, and he does end up spending the rest of his days in prosperity and pleasure. But he's not there yet, and he Job, and he has a problem with Elihu's defense of God. There's another possibility in terms of how the righteous will respond to God's chastening of them. Verse 12, but if they do not listen, so the first response is you listen and hear and see what God is doing and return to obeying and serving him. And if so, you're going to be in good shape. But if you do not listen, verse 12, they will perish by the sword and die without knowledge. Wow. So that's the second way that Elihu sees someone's possible responses to God if that someone is righteous yet suffering from God's afflictions. And I say God's afflictions. These are afflictions that are common to all of us. Loved ones die. Injuries occur and pain follows. Relationships are destroyed, even without the fault of one. Nevertheless, it may be the fault of the other in a relationship. Nevertheless, that suffering occurs. I see that so much in the cases that come before me in court. Suffering occurs when the relationship is destroyed, even though one is totally without fault in that disruption or destruction of the relationship. And I say totally without fault. Generally, none of us are totally without fault. In any event, Elihu says, if you don't listen to God and realize He is trying to get you to turn back to Him, then you can just be wiped out and die without knowledge from a poor response to God's correcting. Verse 13, the godless in heart harbor resentment, even when He fetters them. They do not cry for help. They die in their youth among male prostitutes of the shrines. By the way, several commentaries that I read, scholars that I turned to in studying for the lesson, suggest that some of these verses are some of the most difficult verses in the Bible to translate. And this one is another one. But the idea here in verse 13 is, if you do not listen to God, if you do not harbor God in your heart, so you're godless in your heart, if you do not call out to God for help. Now, Job is calling out to God for help, so there's nothing wrong. Elihu is almost contradicting himself here. He's chastising and has chastised Job for questioning God, but he says the proper response includes calling out to God, and Job has been doing just that. But those who do not have God in their heart at all, who do not even turn to Him in times of trouble, they die in their youth. And the expression among male prostitutes of the shrines, Elihu is basically saying they die a shameful death. They die in shame, whether they are serving as like a male prostitute in a shrine might do. So you're wrong to question. Elihu says you're wrong to question God. Elihu is wrong there, but that's his statement. And you're wrong to not call out to, cry out to God when you're in trouble. He is correct about that. We should do just that. But now he says, in essence, on the other hand, verse 15, but those who suffer, He delivers in their suffering. He speaks to them in their affliction. So Elihu is saying that, frankly, Job should take heart. God uses oppression and suffering, which Job is experiencing. Now, God uses that, says Elihu, to open our eyes and our ears to hear God's voice. And Elihu now is giving Job hope that God will deliver him even in the midst of his afflictions. And so Job is a book where many people turn to for hope in their afflictions. Elihu is trying to give that to Job. And he is right. His premise is off, though. And he continues this positive note in verse 16. He is wooing you from the jaws of distress to a spacious place free from restriction, so the comfort of your to the comfort of your table, laden with choice food. Interesting. So Elihu is holding out hope for Job that God can and will deliver him, Job, out of his tragic circumstances that are just almost crushing Job. And he's saying that God can lead you back into an open, broad space where everything is good. Just hope on God. Now that's another good truism from Elihu. But God hasn't done that for Job just yet. And Elihu thinks that's because Job has been focused on the wrong thing. Let's look and see. Verse 17, but now you are laden with judgment due the wicked. Judgment and justice have taken hold of you. You are being consumed with the fact that you are under God's judgment, thus you are suffering His punishment. And because you have been upset about that and telling God that that's wrong, this judgment and God's justice has taken a hold of you. Likely he is saying that God has brought judgment and justice upon Job because, we get that from the next couple of verses where Elihu goes on to talk about wrath in the next verse. Perhaps the wrath that comes from God's just judgment and justice. Verse 18. Be careful that no one entices you by riches. Do not let a large bribe turn you aside. Now that sounds, to me, it sounds a little bit strange talking to Job. First of all, he has nothing with which to give a bribe. But you need to be careful, Elihu says, because God is already bringing some level of judgment upon you. And if you're not careful, Job, if you don't stop being so preoccupied with what the wicked deserve versus what you deserve. In other words, Job has been saying, okay, I understand punishment for the wicked, but I'm not wicked. So why the punishment on me? So Elihu says, quit being concerned about, because God's wrath might be just ratcheted up, and there's a possibility that God could just take you out with a stroke of his discipline. And if that were to happen, there's no amount of money that can deliver you from God's wrath. You can't bribe anybody to protect you. You can't bribe God. Verse 19, would your wealth or even all your mighty efforts sustain you so you would not be in distress? If God's judgment is upon you, is your wealth going to protect you? Even if you make all the great efforts that you protest that you have, is that going to help you? Nothing can deliver you from God's wrath, says Elihu. So Elihu's message to Job is to stop being upset at God and stop constantly comparing your situation to the situation of the wicked. They deserve God's punishment. Quit saying you don't, says Job. That's a dangerous mindset. Verse 20, do not long for the night to drag people away from their homes. He seems to be suggesting that Job might be having this inner thought that says, it's all right for somebody else who is wicked to be punished, even like if I went into their home at night and dragged them out away from their homes so they could be punished. Certainly sounds somewhat extreme statement from Elihu, because Job is not doing that. He is not even trying to. But Elihu, in this portion of his address to Job, seems to be saying that Job has turned to evil in his afflictions in other ways. Unlike Job's friends who said, you're being punished because you did evil, obviously, and Job protests, Elihu says, your protests, in essence, are evil. Verse 21, beware of turning to evil, which you seem to prefer to affliction. Here he's warning Job. Elihu is warning Job. Don't turn to doing evil. That is, to suggest that God is not treating you justly. In essence, you've already begun doing that when you started questioning God's justice. When you started saying, God, you're not being just to me. You're not treating me fairly. Elihu says, or implies, that Job has chosen evil. It's evil to question God, thinks Elihu. Now we know from throughout the rest of the Bible, that's not evil. It is, as long as we turn to God recognizing He is supreme, it's appropriate to ask him questions. Job suggests if we are doing the same thing that Job has done, that is questioning God's goodness and justice when we're suffering, well, Elihu is going to tell us what we really ought to be thinking. And then we turn to our last two verses. Elihu says, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? In verse 23, who has prescribed his ways for him and said to him, you have done wrong? The answer is no one has assigned tasks to God. God doesn't have a supervisor. He is sovereign. And unlike others who may think they have no supervisor, God himself does not have a supervisor. So Elihu is reminding Job and us that we need to think, when we are questioning God, his goodness and his justness, we need to think about God as sovereign. Look at the work, look at creation, magnify God, worship him fully. And that should be our response. By the way, there's nothing wrong with that truism from Elihu. He just has his premise askew. I believe it's absolutely fine to ask questions of God, but to do so with the mindset that he is sovereign, that he has ways that we do not know, that he has considerations that we aren't aware of. God's going to tell Job that later on in the book. But I think it's all right to try to figure out why we are suffering. I remember Betsy asking God, but she asked it this way. She's questioning God. She asked it this way when trying to understand what to do with the cancer or what the cancer meant to. She said, God, what am I supposed to learn from this? What am I supposed to, how am I supposed to know what to do? As long as we recognize God as sovereign, knowing that his works are mighty and he can raise us up out of the affliction at any moment, even if it's caused by somebody else, even if it's caused by us, he is God. And like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even if he doesn't deliver me from the fiery furnace, he is still my God, and I will serve him. Interesting study. We only have a couple of more chapters in Job, a couple of more lessons in Job. Won't you continue to join us in this study? Thank you. Good morning.